My name is Beatrice Campbell, and I was 30 the year I bought my father's legacy out from under the brother who was actively destroying it. It started with a phone call at 8 in the morning on Thanksgiving. I had spent the last 5 years building a life in Austin, working as an IT manager specifically because my own father looked me in the eye and handed his entire freight company to my older brother. My father told me, daughters do not run businesses, they marry them. I sat in a mahogany-paneled office, smelling of diesel and old paper, signed the waiver, and walked away with nothing, while my brother was handed an empire he had not earned. So you can imagine the quiet shock I felt when my mother called me on a holiday and demanded $500,000 to save the very company I was deemed unfit to inherit. What she expected me to do, I will get to. But her entitlement was not even the most toxic part of that morning. My brother had a worse secret hiding in his ledgers. And what I did over the next 30 days, using nothing but data and patience none of them saw coming. Some bridges you burn, some you buy and charge a toll to cross. Welcome back to Still Drama Stories, where we tell quiet stories about ordinary people, impossible choices, and the moment the truth finally gets a seat at the table. If you have ever been passed over for someone less competent just because of tradition, this one is for you. Stay with me because the part that matters most does not happen during this phone call. It happens in a high-tech boardroom when the people who counted me out realize I hold their debt. Drop your age in the comments below and be sure to subscribe. For 5 years, my survival strategy was simple distance. Austin was an entirely different universe from the dusty freight yards of East Texas where I grew up. The culture here in Silicon Hills rewarded actual competence. If you could build a better network architecture or spot a vulnerability in a server array, nobody cared whose daughter you were. I leaned into that meritocracy. While my brother Trevor played executive back home, I put my head down and managed enterprise IT infrastructure for a prominent tech firm. I fixed problems, streamlined systems, and cashed out my stock options when we went public in the spring. I built a fortress of a life on the 30th floor of a downtown high-rise, and I paid for every inch of it myself. I traded archaic family favoritism for clean, undeniable code. That Thanksgiving morning, the sky over Lady Bird Lake was the color of slate. I stood at my quartz kitchen island, drinking dark roast coffee and enjoying the rare silence of a holiday in the city. The streets below were empty of commuters, leaving only a few determined runners braving the cold wind. My apartment hummed with the quiet efficiency of servers and smart thermostats. It was a space designed for peace. Then my phone lit up on the counter. The screen displayed a name I had not seen in 8 months. Diane Campbell. My mother possessed a specific talent for timing. She understood exactly when a person might drop their guard and chose that exact second to strike. I set my ceramic mug down. I did not feel panic. When you spend your career migrating petabytes of data and hunting threats in corporate networks, you learn to treat incoming crises as puzzles rather than emergencies. You look for the weak points. You analyze the vector. I swiped the green icon and held the phone to my ear. "Hello, Mom," I said. "Trevor is losing the company," she answered. No holiday greeting, no hesitation. 12 seconds into the call, she bypassed every polite convention and dropped her demand. Her voice carried that tight, frantic energy she always used right before issuing an order. She expected me to react, to ask what was wrong, to fall back into the role of the obedient daughter waiting for instructions. "Good morning to you, too," I replied, keeping my tone level. "Do not be clever, Beatrice," she snapped. I could hear a truck horn blare somewhere in the background on her end. "We do not have time for it. Campbell Freight is in default. The bank is circling and your brother is out of runway. We need $500,000 by Tuesday or we lose the legacy." The legacy! She wielded the phrase like a crowbar, trying to pry open my conscience. 5 years ago, that word might have meant something to me. Back then, I believed sweat equity earned you a seat at the table. I remembered staying up late configuring routing software for the truck fleet, while Trevor crashed company vehicles and failed his business classes. Yet he was the one who inherited the keys because of his gender. The legacy was his burden now. $500,000 is a significant liquidity request, I murmured, watching a single rower navigate the cold water far below my window. "You have it," she insisted, her voice thinning into a sharp edge. "We know about the stock options from your firm. We know you cashed out. Family takes care of family, Beatrice. Trevor needs this. I let the word family hang in the digital space between us. For the Campbells, it was never a bond. It was a password they used to bypass accountability. It meant I was supposed to fund my brother's failure without asking questions. If Trevor is seeking bridge capital, he knows standard business procedure. I told her, he can pitch me. This is not some tech startup pitch. Her breath hitched, executing a seamless pivot toward tears. It was a tactic she had perfected over decades. This is your father's life work. If you do not wire the funds, Trevor loses everything. I lose my home. We need you to step up and save us. I traced the rim of my coffee mug. A crisis on a holiday morning meant the situation was not just dire, it was terminal. If they were begging the daughter they discarded for cash, every other financial avenue had already been exhausted. But an IT manager does not patch a crashing server without first finding the root cause of the breach. Throwing cash at a sinking freight company without reviewing the ledger was the financial equivalent of clicking a phishing link. I do not wire $500,000 based on an emotional phone call, I said. My voice did not shake. It held the firm, sterile boundary of a firewall. If Campbell Freight requires a cash injection, I need to see the books. Tell Trevor to send me the trailing 12 months of profit and loss statements, the current balance sheet, and his detailed debt schedules. Silence stretched across the line. I could almost hear the gears grinding in her head, calculating how to push past a boundary built on strict logic rather than traditional guilt. She was used to people caving when she cried. She did not know how to handle someone asking for documentation. "It is Thanksgiving," she finally said. The tears vanished, replaced by familiar East Texas frost. "Then he has until Friday evening to send the files," I answered. "Have a good holiday." I ended the call and placed the device face down on the quartz counter. The legacy was bleeding out, and they wanted my money to serve as the tourniquet. But I was not going to heal their wounds blindly. I walked into my home office, booted up my dual monitors, and waited. I was going to run an audit, and they had no idea what kind of storm they had just invited into their system. Sitting in my quiet home office, waiting for the financial documents to arrive, the soft whir of my computer cooling fans pulled my mind backward. 5 years backward, to be exact, to a sweltering July afternoon in East Texas. Before the high-rise apartment, before the successful tech initial public offering, and long before I learned how to track hidden assets through encrypted servers, I was just a grieving daughter sitting in a law office. The contrast between my current reality and that memory felt sharp enough to cut glass. I had spent my teenage years and early 20s working in the dispatch center of Campbell Freight. While my older brother Trevor was out denting company pickup trucks and failing basic accounting courses, I was the one untangling the logistical nightmares. I learned the routing software inside and out. I wrote custom scripts to optimize driver schedules, cut fuel costs, and keep the aging fleet running on time. The scent of diesel exhaust and hot asphalt was woven into my clothes. I knew the operational architecture of that company better than the men who founded it. When my father passed away, I naively assumed the reading of his will would reflect the undeniable sweat equity I had deposited into the family ledger. The office of the estate attorney smelled of floor wax and stale cigar smoke. Heavy mahogany panels lined the walls, absorbing the light and making the room feel like a vault. The air conditioning rattled above us, struggling against the oppressive East Texas summer heat, pressing against the window panes. My mother Diane sat in a high-backed leather chair, dabbing her dry eyes with a tissue. Trevor sat beside her wearing a dark suit that fit him poorly, projecting a false sense of solemnity. I sat across from them, my hands folded on the polished wood table, waiting for the future of Campbell Freight to be handed over to the next generation. The attorney cleared his throat and adjusted his reading glasses. He read through the standard distributions first. The primary residence went to my mother. The personal cash reserves were divided. Then he reached the corporate holdings. I leaned forward slightly, ready to accept the responsibility I had prepared for my entire adult life. The attorney read the final disposition. 100% of the voting shares, the total operational control of Campbell Freight, and the commercial real estate it occupied were transferred solely to Trevor. I stared at the grain of the mahogany table. I did not blink. I waited for the rest of the sentence, a contingency clause, a division of equity, anything that acknowledged my existence in the company. Nothing came. Instead, the attorney pulled a separate piece of cream-colored stationery from the folder. My father had attached a personal letter to the legal documents, a final message from the grave to justify his decisions. The attorney read it out loud, his voice flat and detached. The letter praised Trevor for carrying on the family name. Then it addressed me. The exact words burned themselves into my memory. The freight business requires a certain type of firm hand, my father had written. Daughters do not run businesses. They marry them. The silence that followed those words was thick and suffocating. Diane looked over at me with a soft, pitying smile, the kind of expression reserved for a child who has just learned a harsh truth about the world. Trevor tried to maintain a respectful frown, but the corners of his mouth twitched upward, betraying his deep, unearned triumph. They both sat there waiting for the inevitable explosion. They expected me to cry. They anticipated a scene. They wanted me to raise my voice, to beg for a minority stake, to demand my rightful place in the empire I had helped optimize. They wanted me to perform the role of the hysterical, discarded woman so they could feel justified in taking everything. But working with complex software systems teaches you a valuable lesson about architecture. When a system is flawed at its core level, you do not waste your energy trying to patch it. You do not argue with a broken machine. You migrate to a new server and leave the archaic framework behind to collapse under its own weight. I looked at my mother. I looked at my brother. I saw the deep roots of their entitlement, a belief system that prized outdated familial favoritism over actual strategic competence. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice. I reached across the mahogany table and took the legal waiver the attorney had prepared, the document confirming my acceptance of the estate terms. I pulled my own pen from my purse. I signed my name in clean dark blue ink. I stood up, smoothed the front of my dress, and wished them both the best of luck with the business. Then I turned around and walked out of the air-conditioned office into the heat of the afternoon. That same evening, I packed my sedan with every piece of clothing and electronic equipment I owned. I left the keys to the company dispatch center on the kitchen counter of my childhood home. I pointed the hood of my car west and drove toward the Texas Hill Country. Watching the pine trees fade in the rear-view mirror felt like watching an outdated operating system uninstall. I was leaving a world that demanded my submission and heading toward one that would demand my intellect. Arriving in Austin felt like taking my very first real breath. The culture in Silicon Hills was entirely different. It was a highly dynamic, forward-thinking tech ecosystem. This environment did not care who your grandfather was. It did not care if you wore the right boots or attended the correct country club. The tech sector rewarded innovation. It was a culture built on fierce independence and meritocracy. If you could write clean code, if you could secure a network, if you could solve a problem faster and better than the person sitting next to you, you earned your seat at the table. I took an entry-level IT support job and treated it like a relentless logic puzzle. I studied cybersecurity protocols late into the night. I climbed the corporate ranks by anticipating vulnerabilities before they could be exploited. I applied the exact same logistical mind that had organized freight routes to managing enterprise server architectures. When the tech firm I helped build went public, my stock options vested. I achieved true financial independence. I embraced the Texas ideal of legal asset protection and built my net worth in a digital currency my family could never touch or diminish. While I was building a modern fortress, Trevor was playing executive in a dying era. He had been handed a thriving logistics company and driven it straight into the ground. My family had clung to their archaic nepotism, convinced that tradition alone would keep the balance sheets in the black. They valued gender and birthright over skill and dedication. Now the golden sun had steered their precious legacy to the very edge of a cliff, and my mother was looking for a safety net. The soft chime of my email inbox brought me snapping back to the present moment. I blinked, returning my focus to the glow of the dual monitors in my Austin apartment. An incoming message sat at the top of the queue. The sender was Trevor Campbell. The subject line read, "Urgent financials," just as I had requested. They thought they were sending a few spreadsheets to a wealthy sister to secure a quick bailout. They had no idea they had just handed their digital footprint over to a network security expert who knew exactly how to hunt. I opened the email from my brother. The subject line was entirely blank. The body contained a single demanding sentence instructing me to confirm when the wire transfer cleared. Attached below his signature were 5 separate files. I downloaded the documents and arranged them across my left monitor. They were a complete disaster. Trevor had apparently printed the financial statements, scanned the crumpled pages crookedly, and saved them as unsearchable image files. The profit and loss sheets were condensed to a point of sheer absurdity. Entire vital expense categories were lumped together under vague, meaningless headings like general operations and miscellaneous overhead. Thick blocks of black digital marker covered several specific line items. He had actually redacted the ledgers of his own company before sending them to the exact person he was begging for $500,000 in capital. He assumed I would glance at the red negative numbers at the bottom of the page, panic out of familial obligation, and blindly authorize the cash transfer. He still saw me as the girl who used to reset his passwords, a glorified help desk attendant who happened to be holding a checkbook. He viewed my career in network architecture as a cute niche hobby that somehow magically made me wealthy. He did not respect the intense discipline required to build and secure an enterprise network. He only respected the cash it produced. His arrogance was not just insulting, it was a structural vulnerability. And in my profession, a vulnerability is an entry point. I did not call him to demand cleaner files. I did not point out the sloppy, amateurish redactions. I drafted a concise, professional reply. I informed him that my wealth management firm operated under strict compliance regulations. Any liquidity transfer exceeding $250,000 triggered mandatory institutional verification protocols. I explained that a static redacted image file was insufficient for their due diligence. To authorize the $500,000 my banking team required direct, read-only administrative access to Campbell Freight's back-end enterprise resource planning software. I hit send and watched the email vanish into the ether. I knew Trevor was desperate, and desperation creates a very specific kind of blindness. 30 minutes later, my inbox chimed. He replied with a web address, a dedicated username, and a temporary password. He added a note telling me to hurry up and play auditor so we could get the transaction over with. He believed he was humoring me. He thought the company's software interface was far too complicated for an outsider to navigate quickly enough to spot any real issues. He failed to realize that his specific legacy platform was the exact system I had spent 3 years migrating, patching, and securing for a major corporate client. He had just handed the keys to his kingdom directly to a master locksmith. The sun set over Austin, turning the sky a deep bruised purple before fading into black. The city lights flickered on, reflecting in the glass of my high-rise windows and casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. The ambient noise of downtown traffic faded into a low, steady hum. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee, tied my hair back into a tight knot, and flexed my fingers. I clicked the web link and entered the credentials. The company dashboard loaded on my right monitor. It featured colorful graphs and cheerful green arrows pointing upward, presenting a sanitized view of the company's health. I did not bother looking at the polished executive summaries. Dashboards are designed to pacify shareholders. I went straight for the basement. I bypassed the user-friendly interface and opened the administrative command console, skipping the glossy menus to access the raw server logs. The screen filled with cascading lines of text, a beautiful, sterile waterfall of data. This enterprise resource planning software connected every single node of Campbell Freight. It linked the truck dispatch positioning trackers, the employee payroll timesheets, and the vendor invoicing modules into one central nervous system. By giving me admin rights, Trevor had given me the ability to view every pulse of that system. Every keystroke, every login session duration, every modification ever made within the network was recorded right here in plain text. Metadata does not lie. It does not feel loyalty. It does not care about your last name or your father's legacy. It simply remembers. I pulled the Internet Protocol login histories for the past 12 months, filtering by geographic location and time of day. I extracted the transactional metadata for the accounts payable ledger, exporting it into a clean, sortable database. I began to cross-reference the digital timestamps against the dates listed on Trevor's messy attachments. My mechanical keyboard clacked rhythmically in the quiet apartment, a steady percussion driving the investigation forward. The glow of the monitors bathed the room in a pale blue light, isolating me in a bubble of pure logic. The discrepancies began to surface within the first hour of the trace. When you alter a financial document and export it as a static image, the surface looks clean to the untrained eye. but the back-end system always retains the scar of the edit. I found the original ledger entries that Trevor had attempted to hide under digital black ink. I placed the raw data on my right screen and his scanned pages on my left, aligning the rows side by side. The numbers did not match, not even closely. The files he sent me claimed the company was losing money due to rising diesel fuel costs and depressed regional shipping rates. He was trying to build a narrative blaming the macroeconomic market for his failure. The raw data told a vastly different story. The incoming freight revenues were actually remarkably stable, the shipping volume steady. The cash was not drying up. It was bleeding out through the accounts payable module. The tension in my chest tightened not from anxiety, but from the sharp thrill of the hunt. I isolated a specific vendor payment marked for warehouse maintenance. On Trevor's version, it was a modest $3,000 charge. In the raw server log, that exact transaction identifier showed a real-time disbursement of $18,000. I found another discrepancy under fleet repairs. His document showed $5,000. The server recorded $25,000. He had manually altered the reports before emailing them to me. He was actively doctoring the books. I pulled up the user activity logs to see who had executed the alterations. The system recorded the action under Trevor's unique administrator profile. He had made the changes just 2 hours before sending his initial demand. My brother was not a victim of a tough economy or bad luck. He was the architect of his own collapse, and he was trying to use my money to cover his tracks. The audit had officially moved beyond a simple financial review. It was now a forensic extraction, and I was going to pull every skeleton out of his digital closet. The digital trail led deeper into the labyrinth of the accounts payable module. I adjusted my posture in my ergonomic chair, letting the pale blue light of the monitors wash over my face. The initial discrepancies I discovered were clumsy alterations. They were the crude, panicked edits a desperate amateur makes when trying to hide a shrinking bottom line from a potential investor. But a regional logistics company does not face imminent default over a few inflated warehouse maintenance invoices. There had to be a severe arterial bleed elsewhere in the ledger. I ran a custom query in the command console, instructing the server to isolate and rank all recurring vendor disbursements over the past 36 months. The database chewed on the command for several seconds before generating a neatly sorted spreadsheet. At the very top of the list sat a monthly expense that eclipsed every other operational cost. It was categorized under technology procurement. The sum was staggering, draining capital at an unsustainable velocity. I opened the corresponding digital contract repository. The system required a secondary authorization, but Trevor had granted me full administrative privileges, essentially leaving the corporate vault door wide open. I downloaded the primary service agreement and began to read the fine print. My brother had locked Campbell Freight into a 5-year binding arrangement for proprietary routing software. The terms were draconian. The deal included an automatic renewal stipulation, mandatory annual fee escalations, and a cancellation penalty so steep it would bankrupt a small municipality. Worse than the predatory contract terms was the software itself. I recognized the application suite from my early days in network architecture. It was a bloated, obsolete platform known throughout the tech sector for causing frequent system crashes and providing wildly inaccurate delivery estimates. The interface was archaic, the underlying code was inefficient, and the original developer support had ceased existing 3 years ago. Yet the price tag attached to this specific agreement reflected a 300% markup over premium state-of-the-art alternatives. Trevor was paying luxury corporate rates for digital scrap metal. A legitimate chief executive officer does not make a procurement error of this magnitude by accident. This was not a simple oversight or a misunderstanding of the technology market. It was a deliberate choice. I needed to know who was cashing the checks. The vendor was listed on the invoices as Horizon Logistics Solutions, a limited liability company registered in Delaware. The corporate veil is designed to protect identities and shield owners from scrutiny, but privacy is an illusion if you know which digital threads to pull. I opened a secure encrypted browser window and accessed the State Commerce Registry. The registered agent was a generic legal firm, a standard tactic for hiding actual ownership. I pivoted my approach, pulling the payment routing numbers from the server logs and running a targeted search through public financial filings and connected domain registrations. The web host for Horizon Logistics Solutions was registered to a residential address in a wealthy suburb of Dallas. I cross-referenced the address with county property tax records. The name of the homeowner populated on my screen. Blake Harding. I leaned back against my chair and let a slow, heavy breath escape my lungs. Blake Harding. The name tasted like stale beer and cheap cologne. 10 years ago, Blake and Trevor shared a cramped dormitory at their university in College Station. They spent 4 years cheating on business ethics exams, tailgating at football games, and barely graduating. They were partners in mediocrity. Blake had zero experience in enterprise software. He had no background in logistics or supply chain management. He was simply a guy who recognized an easy mark in his old drinking companion. A sharp, familiar sting of rejection flared in my chest. When I was 19 years old, I spent an entire summer sitting in the sweltering, unair-conditioned dispatch center of Campbell Freight. I noticed the dispatchers were struggling with overlapping delivery windows and wasted fuel miles. So I taught myself how to write code. I built an elegant custom routing script from scratch. It optimized driver schedules, calculated traffic patterns in real time, and saved my father thousands of dollars a month in diesel expenses. I did it for free because I wanted to prove my value. I wanted to show them that a daughter could contribute something vital and intelligent to the family enterprise. When Trevor inherited the company, he threw my work in the trash. He sidelined his own sister, an accomplished tech professional, to purchase obsolete garbage software from an unqualified fraternity brother. He sold out the operational efficiency of his father's legacy to line the pockets of a drinking buddy. This revelation crystallized the entire situation. He did not value tradition. He only valued his own ego and the comfort of his sycophants. He would rather watch trucks sit idle and drivers miss their delivery windows than admit a woman had built a superior system. The urge to pick up my phone and call him was a brief, hot flash. I wanted to hear his voice crack as I confronted him with the evidence. I wanted to demand an explanation for the catastrophic waste of capital. I wanted to ask him how it felt to be swindled by a man he considered a friend. But premature confrontation is the hallmark of a novice. Yelling provides a temporary emotional release, but it surrenders the strategic advantage. I was not playing for an apology. I was playing for the entire board. I kept my hands on the keyboard. My fingers moved with rapid surgical precision. I captured high-resolution screenshots of the Horizon Logistics contract, highlighting the exorbitant fee structures and the automatic renewal clauses. I downloaded the server metadata documenting the exact timestamps when Trevor signed the digital authorizations. I traced the internal protocol addresses, proving the approval came directly from his executive terminal in East Texas. Every piece of evidence was exported encrypted and saved to a secure external drive sitting on my desk. I watched the progress bar fill as the files transferred, locking the truth away behind a complex cryptographic key. I created a dedicated folder labeled Procurement Fraud. It was a sterile objective name for a deeply personal betrayal. The evidence I had gathered was already sufficient to prove extreme fiduciary negligence. In a standard corporate environment, this buddy contract alone would be grounds for immediate termination by a board of directors. Shareholders would demand restitution. But Campbell Freight had no board of directors. It only had Trevor sinking his own ship while begging me for a life raft. I stared at the blinking cursor on my terminal. A 5-year contract at a 300% markup was a significant financial drain, but it did not fully explain the severe default Diane had described on the phone. Blake Harding was siphoning cash, but he was just a parasite attached to the hull. A company processing the volume of freight my father built does not collapse solely from one terrible software deal. There was something else happening in the background. I sensed a darker, more deliberate current pulling the capital away from the reserves. The altered ledgers and the buddy contract were just the superficial symptoms of a much deeper rot. I adjusted the brightness on my monitors, letting the harsh light sharpen my focus. I navigated away from the accounts payable module and prepared to access the encrypted payroll databases. I knew the real disease was still hiding somewhere in the code, and I was going to dissect every single line of data until I found it. Navigating away from the vendor contracts, I accessed the central payroll and disbursements database. The apartment was entirely silent now, the city outside my windows asleep, leaving me alone with the rhythmic hum of my computer tower. I initiated a deep scan of the access logs, configuring the parameters to flag any irregular login attempts or atypical session durations over the past 12 months. When the query finished, processing a cluster of data points lit up on my left monitor. It was an anomaly so precise it almost looked like a scheduled system update. Every single Sunday morning at exactly 2 o'clock, an administrator profile accessed the primary financial module. The session always lasted exactly 4 minutes. My pulse steadied into a slow, measured cadence. Growing up, Sundays were the one day the Campbell freight yard was always dark. My father treated Sunday rest like a binding legal contract. The heavy iron gates were locked, the diesel trucks were parked, and the office alarm was armed. My father never allowed a single engine to start on a Sunday. Trevor never woke up before noon on a weekend, let alone in the middle of the night, to balance the corporate ledgers. A recurring instantaneous login at that hour was not human behavior. It was an automated script. Someone had written a macro to bypass the standard authentication protocols and access the core financial systems while the rest of the world slept. I isolated the ghost logins and tracked the digital path of the script. The commands were simple but very effective. Upon entry, the script initiated a recurring automated clearinghouse transfer. It siphoned cash directly from the primary operating account and rerouted it into a secondary ledger designated for external contractors. The script then systematically wiped its own temporary cache data to avoid triggering a daily security alert. I followed the money. The disbursements were categorized under a broad, ambiguous label reading Logistics Consulting Fees. The receiving entity was a vendor named Summit Advisory Group. I opened a new secure search window and ran the vendor name through the state corporate database. Summit Advisory Group was a limited liability company formed 14 months ago. It had no website, no public employee records, and no commercial storefront. The registered address was a post office box in Southlake, a wealthy suburb known for sprawling estates and exclusive amenities. It was a zip code that required a heavy, uninterrupted flow of cash to survive. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair and stared at the ceiling. The pieces of the puzzle began snapping into place with chilling clarity. A few months ago, my mother had posted photos on her social media feed boasting about Trevor's new Mastercraft wakeboard boat. A week later, she shared pictures of him playing golf at a prestigious private country club. I remembered wondering how a man running a struggling regional freight company could afford luxury watercraft and exorbitant initiation fees. The math had refused to align. Now staring at the sterile server logs, the arithmetic was perfectly clear. Trevor was not just incompetent. He was not just funneling minor kickbacks to his college friends. My brother was actively embezzling from his own failing company. He had set up a phantom consulting firm and used an automated script to drain the operating capital while the trucks rusted in the yard. He was stealing the cash-buying boats and playing golf, all while the bank prepared to foreclose on the legacy he had sworn to protect. The situation had escalated far beyond a sad story of a mismanaged family business. It was a literal crime scene. If I wired $500,000 to Campbell Freight, it would not save the company. The money would bypass the legitimate creditors, wash through the payroll accounts, and land directly in the Southlake post office box. Trevor was asking me to fund his felony. He wanted me to become an unwitting accessory to wire fraud. A cold, profound sense of betrayal washed over me, but I did not let it settle in my chest. Emotion is a useless metric when dealing with a compromised network. I needed to convert this betrayal into unarguable data. I opened a blank incident response template on my desktop. I approached the task with the same forensic detachment I used when auditing Fortune 500 tech firms. I created a timeline detailing the exact inception date of the automated script. I captured high-resolution screenshots of the ghost logins, highlighting the 2 o'clock timestamps. I documented the IP addresses, used to create the shell company, cross-referencing them with the public registry to ensure a flawless chain of custody. I extracted the digital signatures attached to the wire transfers, proving that Trevor was the sole authorizing agent for every single fraudulent payout. I downloaded the banking routing numbers, tracing the exact flow of capital from the freight company directly into the Summit Advisory Group accounts. I organized the files into a clean numbered index. Every piece of evidence was verified, time-stamped, and secured behind a cryptographic lock. The document was 40 pages long, filled with raw hexadecimal data server logs and irrefutable financial pathways. I transformed my brother's greed into a pristine, sterile cybersecurity incident report. The numbers were undeniable. The digital footprints were permanent. There was no room for my mother to spin a narrative about hard times or a tough economy. The data proved intent execution and active concealment. By the time I finished compiling the dossier, the sky outside my window had turned a pale, bruised purple, signaling the start of dawn. I had been sitting at my desk for 9 hours. My muscles were stiff, and my eyes burned from the glare of the monitors, but my mind was sharper than it had been in years. I saved the final draft of the report to my encrypted drive and ejected the device, slipping it securely into the pocket of my blazer. The sun breached the horizon, spilling golden light across the Austin skyline. The city was waking up, and the long holiday weekend was coming to an end. The deadline I had given my mother was rapidly approaching, but the dynamic had fundamentally shifted. They thought they were waiting for a naive sister to process a simple wire transfer. They did not realize the person reviewing their request was a network security expert holding evidence of a federal crime. I walked into my kitchen, poured the last cup of stale coffee down the sink, and prepared to head to my corporate office. The silence of my apartment felt heavy with anticipation. I knew my mother would not wait for a digital response. Diane hated losing control, and my refusal to blindly wire the money would force her hand. She was going to demand a face-to-face confrontation. She was going to try to shame me into compliance. I gathered my car keys and my briefcase, knowing the real war was about to begin on my own territory. The transition from the holiday weekend to a standard Monday morning in Austin always brought a sharp shift in energy. My office sat on the 22nd floor of a sleek glass building overlooking the Colorado River. The architecture was minimalist. Polished concrete floors, sound-absorbing acoustic panels, and transparent glass walls defined the space. It was a physical manifestation of transparency and efficiency, the exact opposite of the dark mahogany-paneled rooms where my family preferred to operate. I sat at my desk, running a routine compliance check on a client-server migration, while my encrypted drive rested safely in my blazer pocket. I knew the silence from East Texas would not last. Desperation always finds a vehicle. At 10 o'clock, the intercom on my desk chimed. The receptionist, a young man named David, who rarely sounded flustered, told me I had an unscheduled visitor. He lowered his voice, explaining that a woman claiming to be my mother was in the main lobby. He added that she was speaking very loudly and demanding immediate access to the executive floor. I thanked David and locked my workstation. I did not rush to the elevator. I walked with a measured, deliberate pace. When you manage network security, you learn that rushing toward a threat only signals vulnerability to the attacker. You approach a breach with steady containment. The main lobby of our building was a cavernous space filled with natural light, modern art, and software engineers typing quietly on leather sofas. Diane Campbell stood in the exact center of the room, wearing a tailored navy blazer and a string of pearls. It was the uniform she wore to her country club luncheons. She looked wholly out of place among the startup founders in hoodies and sneakers, but she carried herself as if she owned the building. Her voice echoed off the high ceiling, sharp and indignant. She was berating a security guard who had politely asked her to wait in the seating area. I stepped out of the elevator. My mother spotted me and immediately turned her performance toward the growing audience of tech professionals. "There she is," Diane projected, ensuring her voice carried across the room. "Beatrice, tell these people to let me up. I have driven 3 hours because you refused to answer your phone during a family emergency." She was employing the oldest tactic in her arsenal: public shaming. In her social circle, a loud scene was the ultimate weapon. People usually capitulated just to make the embarrassment stop. She expected me to shrink, to apologize, to rush her into a private room and give her whatever she wanted to avoid a scene in front of my colleagues. I did not shrink. I walked toward her, keeping my hands relaxed at my sides. As her volume increased, I intentionally lowered mine. "Good morning, Mom," I said, my voice barely above a conversational murmur. "You did not have an appointment." "An appointment?" She let out a harsh, theatrical laugh, looking around at the engineers nearby to enlist their sympathy. "A mother does not need a calendar invite to see her daughter when our legacy is on the line. Trevor is waiting. The bank is waiting. Family takes care of family, Beatrice. We do not hide behind receptionists." There was the password. Family takes care of family. She wielded it like a gavel, trying to strike down my professional boundaries. The guard looked at me, ready to intervene, but I gave him a subtle nod of dismissal. I was not going to give her the satisfaction of a forced removal. That would only fuel her narrative of victimization. "If you want to discuss financial matters, we will do it in a conference room," I replied, maintaining a calm, glacial tone. "Follow me." I turned and walked toward the glass-walled meeting rooms lining the southern edge of the lobby. I did not check to see if she was following. I knew she would. She needed the money too badly to walk out. I opened the door to a sterile, soundproof room. It featured a white marble table and 10 ergonomic chairs. The walls were entirely transparent, allowing anyone in the lobby to see inside, but preventing them from hearing a single word. It was the perfect environment for this confrontation. She wanted an audience, so I gave her one that could only observe her behavior without validating her words. Diane stepped inside and dropped her designer handbag onto the marble. Before I even closed the door, she launched into her script. "I cannot believe you are treating us this way." She began, her voice quivering with manufactured grief. "Your father worked his entire life to build Campbell Freight. He bled for those trucks. He gave up his youth so we could have a respectable name in the community. And now when your brother hits a rough patch, you demand paperwork like a stranger." She pressed a manicured hand to her chest right over her pearls. Tears welled in her eyes, pooling perfectly without ruining her makeup. It was a masterclass in emotional manipulation. For years I had fallen for this exact performance. I used to believe those tears were genuine expressions of sorrow or stress. I used to feel an overwhelming sense of guilt, believing I was the cold, unfeeling daughter who failed to understand the heavy burden of my parents' sacrifices. But sitting across from her now, with the encrypted server logs burning a hole in my pocket, I saw the mechanics behind the tears. I observed her clinically. I watched the way she checked my reaction, studying my face to see if the guilt was taking hold. She did not care about the diesel trucks or the routing schedules. My father had built a logistics company, but Diane had built a social identity. Her entire self-worth was tied to being the matriarch of a successful business family. She was mourning the potential loss of her country club membership, her weekly luncheons, and her status in East Texas. The tears were not for my father's legacy, they were for her own vanity. "Trevor sent the initial documents," I stated, keeping my face impassive. "I am reviewing them." "Reviewing them?" She leaned forward, placing both hands on the table. The tears vanished, replaced by a rigid, desperate intensity. "There is nothing to review. The bank is calling the loan due tomorrow. If you do not wire the funds today, they will begin seizing assets. You have the money, Beatrice. We know you do. You sit in this glass tower playing with computers while your family faces ruin." She was trying to provoke me, hunting for a pressure point that would trigger an emotional outburst. An outburst would give her the upper hand. It would frame me as the unstable, vindictive daughter justifying her demands. I refused to hand her that ammunition. I matched her frantic energy with perfect stillness. "Enterprise liquidity transfers require strict compliance protocols," I told her, using the dense corporate terminology I knew she despised. "I cannot bypass federal banking regulations simply because you drove to Austin. The capital allocation process takes time." "We do not have time," she shouted, her voice echoing off the glass. Outside the room, a few software engineers glanced over, witnessing a woman in a navy blazer, losing her composure, while the IT manager sat perfectly calm. "The funds are being structured," I lied smoothly. It was a calculated phrase. It sounded like compliance, but it committed me to nothing. "The financial architecture of a $500,000 disbursement is complex. Screaming at me in a conference room will not expedite the banking clearance." Diane stopped. She stared at me, searching for any trace of weakness, any hint of the obedient girl who used to crave her approval. She found nothing but a polished corporate exterior. She realized her volume was ineffective. Her tears were useless. She was trying to hack a system using outdated credentials. She picked up her handbag, her knuckles white around the leather strap. She straightened her posture, attempting to salvage her dignity. "Your father would be so disappointed in the cold woman you have become," she said, delivering her final venomous strike. "My father made his choices regarding the business," I replied, standing up to signal the end of the meeting. "I am simply making mine. Drive safely, Mom." I opened the door and gestured toward the lobby exit. Diane walked out, her heels clicking sharply against the polished concrete. She kept her chin high, trying to project victory to the onlookers, believing she had successfully pressured me into structuring the funds. She thought she had won a critical battle. She had no idea she had just walked away empty-handed from a war she had already lost. I watched the lobby doors slide shut behind her. The emotional ambush had failed. I had secured my boundary, but her visit confirmed a critical piece of the puzzle. Her desperation was too acute. A failing freight company facing standard foreclosure does not send a matriarch driving 3 hours to stage a public meltdown. Something else was at risk, something personal. I returned to my desk, locked the door, and prepared to dig deeper into the asset records. I needed to know exactly what the bank was threatening to take. The click of my office door locking behind me sounded louder than usual. I walked back to my workstation, the lingering scent of my mother's expensive floral perfume slowly dissipating into the filtered air of the executive floor. My pulse remained steady, but my mind raced, processing the physical data Diane had just provided. A standard commercial default does not cause a matriarch who prides herself on immaculate composure to drive across the state and stage a theatrical meltdown in a corporate lobby. Corporate bankruptcy protects personal assets. Trevor losing the freight company would damage their social standing, but it would not leave them destitute. Yet Diane had looked genuinely terrified beneath her anger. The fear in her eyes was raw. It was the specific, visceral panic of someone whose personal survival is directly threatened. I sat down in my ergonomic chair and woke up my monitors. I needed to understand her true exposure. I opened a secure encrypted browser and accessed the state property registry. When you understand how financial ecosystems operate, you know that money always leaves a paper trail, but real estate leaves a permanent anchor. I bypassed the corporate filings for Campbell Freight and focused my query on the Campbell Family Trust, the legal entity my father had established to hold their personal assets. I pulled the deeds, the tax assessments, and the Uniform Commercial Code filings for East Texas. My fingers moved swiftly across the keyboard, filtering out the decades of standard municipal tax payments and basic utility records. I narrowed the search parameters to the last 12 months, matching the timeline of Trevor's accelerating embezzlement scheme. The database returned a cluster of recent filings attached to the primary residence. The property was a sprawling, single-story brick house set back on 3 acres of manicured lawn. I grew up within those walls. I learned to write code at the kitchen table, while my father reviewed logistics manifests in the next room. My father had paid off the original mortgage 10 years before he died, securing the property free and clear to ensure my mother would always have a permanent shelter. But the registry screen now displayed a glaring red flag. 6 months ago, a fresh encumbrance was recorded against the deed. It was a secondary lien. I downloaded the public loan summary and read the terms. It was a high-yield, short-term commercial bridge loan issued by a predatory regional lender. The borrower was Campbell Freight. The collateral was the family home. Trevor had leveraged the very roof over his mother's head to secure a sudden infusion of cash. And based on the ghost payroll logs I had uncovered earlier, he had not used that cash to save the business. He had used it to sustain his phantom consulting fees, his country club dues, and his luxury boat. The bridge loan was a desperate attempt to cover the gaping hole his embezzlement had created, and now the loan was coming due. If the freight company defaulted on Tuesday, the lender would immediately initiate foreclosure proceedings on the house. A strange cold knot formed in my stomach. For the first time since my father's will reading 5 years ago, I felt a sharp pang of genuine pity for my mother. Diane was a difficult, demanding woman who valued status above all else, but she did not deserve to be rendered homeless by her own son. I imagined her sitting in her pristine living room, entirely unaware that her golden boy had quietly gambled away her security to fund a fraudulent lifestyle. I pictured Trevor bringing her the paperwork under false pretenses, perhaps telling her it was a routine business document requiring her signature as a formality. It made sick, tragic sense. Diane had driven to Austin to beg for $500,000 because Trevor had likely confessed that the bank was taking her home, feeding her a lie about depressed shipping rates while hiding his theft. She was fighting for her survival, fighting for the boy who had betrayed her. It was a pathetic, heartbreaking scenario. But in my profession, you never accept a narrative without verifying the code beneath it. Pity is a human emotion. Data is a universal truth. I needed to see the exact structure of the bridge loan. Using the access Trevor had foolishly granted me, I navigated back into the corporate document repository on the freight company server. I located the encrypted folder containing the recent financing agreements. I extracted the finalized digitally signed document of the bridge loan contract. The agreement required the signature of the primary property owner to authorize the lien. My mother's looping elegant cursive was stamped at the bottom of the final page, executed via a secure electronic signature platform. I did not stop at the visual confirmation. I opened the digital certificate attached to the signature file to examine the metadata. An electronic signature captures more than just an image of a name. It records the exact time-date hardware identification and Internet Protocol address of the device used to execute the binding agreement. I parsed the raw text of the certificate. The signature was logged at 3 in the afternoon on a Tuesday. I looked at the originating IP address. It was a residential broadband sequence. I opened a secondary command terminal and ran a trace on the network address. The geographic locator pinpointed the signal directly to the physical coordinates of my parents' house in East Texas. But that was not the detail that made the blood freeze in my veins. The device identification string listed the specific hardware used to authorize the document. It was an Apple iPad Pro. Trevor did not use Apple products. He was fiercely loyal to his customized Windows machines for both personal and business use. There was only one person in the Campbell family who used an iPad Pro. I had purchased it for Diane myself 3 years ago as a Mother's Day gift. She used it daily to read digital magazines and manage her social calendar. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Trevor had not tricked her into signing a physical piece of paper in the dark. He had not forged her signature. Diane had sat in her own living room, logged onto her own personal device, and intentionally authorized the lien on her own home. She had read the terms. She had agreed to leverage the house to inject cash into the failing company, but it went deeper than simple authorization. The bridge loan was executed 6 months ago. By that point, the phantom payroll script had already been draining the corporate accounts for over a year. The initial capital reserves were already gone. Diane was the original bookkeeper for Campbell Freight, before my father hired a professional accounting firm. She knew how to read a balance sheet. She knew what an operating margin looked like. If she authorized a high-risk bridge loan against her primary asset, she had demanded to see the books first. She knew the money was missing. She knew her son was stealing it. Diane was not a victim of Trevor's fraud. She was complicit in the cover-up. She had willingly mortgaged her own shelter to quietly fill the crater her son had blasted into the company ledgers, hoping the cash infusion would keep the business afloat long enough to hide his felony from the regional bank. When the bridge loan money ran out and the default loomed again, she realized her gamble had failed. The bank was coming for the deed. That was why she drove to Austin. She had not come to save my father's legacy. She had not come because she was a desperate, uninformed widow. She drove to Silicon Hills to run a calculated con on her discarded daughter. She wanted to extract $500,000 from my hard-earned tech equity to pay off the predatory lender, silence the auditors, and erase the evidence of Trevor's embezzlement. She was willing to sacrifice my financial independence to buy her criminal son a clean slate and protect her own social standing. The sheer breathtaking audacity of the betrayal stripped away any remaining trace of familial obligation I held. They had handed the empire to a thief, enabled his theft, and then expected the exiled sister to foot the bill when the bill came due. I stared at the metadata on the screen, letting the cold, sterile reality wash over me. The emotional manipulation in the conference room was just a smokescreen. My mother had looked me in the eye and tried to rob me. I closed the loan document and locked the server terminal. I did not feel anger. Anger is erratic and unfocused. I felt clear and unburdened. They had built a house of cards on a foundation of fraud, and they were relying on my silence and my capital to keep the wind from knocking it down. I ejected the encrypted drive from my workstation and slipped it back into my pocket. It was time to stop reacting to their demands. It was time to take the board. The revelation of Diane's complicity hung in the quiet air of my office, a heavy, suffocating truth that would have shattered the girl I used to be. For a brief moment, the sting of a double betrayal pressed against my ribs. My mother had not just turned a blind eye to my brother stealing our family legacy. She had actively mortgaged her own shelter to finance his cover-up, and then she drove across the state to con me into footing the bill. A lesser person might have broken down right there at the desk. I might have called her phone, demanded an explanation, and let the messy, useless emotions spill out into the open. But I did not reach for my phone. I closed the server connection, ejected my encrypted drive, and initiated what I call the forensic pause. In network security, when you discover a critical breach inside a trusted system, panic is your worst enemy. You do not strike the machine. You do not alert the intruder. You isolate the corrupted nodes, preserve the digital evidence, and rewrite the operational parameters to turn their own intrusion against them. I stood up, smoothed my blazer, and walked out of my office. The Austin afternoon sun hit me as I stepped onto the pavement, baking the limestone sidewalks and radiating a dry, fierce heat. The dynamic tech ecosystem of this city rewarded strategic competence, and I was about to apply those exact principles to a deeply archaic familial dispute. I bypassed my usual lunch spot and walked 3 blocks down Congress Avenue toward a towering building composed of steel and dark reflective glass. I was not looking for a therapist to process my feelings. I was looking for a corporate shark. Marcus Caldwell operated his boutique legal practice from a corner suite on the 35th floor. He was a native Texan who had built his reputation not on polite mediation, but on ruthless efficiency in distressed asset management and hostile acquisitions. He wore custom-tailored suits and kept his office devoid of personal photographs, preferring the sterile aesthetic of brushed metal and bare leather. He did not waste time, and he did not tolerate clients who let sentimentality cloud their financial judgment. That made him the perfect partner for my next move. His assistant guided me into the inner office. Marcus sat behind a wide slab of polished granite, his attention fixed on a complex legal brief. He looked up, motioning for me to take the chair opposite his desk. I did not offer small talk about the holiday weekend or the weather. I opened my briefcase, extracted a thick, color-coded binder along with a secure digital tablet, and placed them both on the granite surface. "I have a corporate crisis requiring immediate intervention," I stated, taking my seat. "My brother is the chief executive officer of Campbell Freight. He is actively embezzling from his own operating accounts, and the company is currently in technical default." Marcus leaned forward, his interest piqued by the sterile delivery of such severe allegations. He opened the binder. I had formatted the cybersecurity incident report to be legible for a legal professional, translating the raw hexadecimal data into a clear, devastating narrative. I walked him through the timeline section by section. I showed him the ghost payroll logins executed by an automated script at 2 o'clock every Sunday morning. I pointed out the shell company registered to a luxury zip code in Southlake, documenting the precise flow of stolen capital used to fund Trevor's country club lifestyle and watercraft purchases. Then I swiped the tablet screen to display the procurement fraud. I traced the catastrophic software contract to Trevor's college drinking companion, detailing the exorbitant fee structure designed to siphon away legitimate revenue. Finally, I turned to the real estate section. I showed Marcus the high-interest commercial bridge loan secured by my parents' primary residence. I highlighted the digital certificate and the metadata proving my mother had authorized the lien from her personal tablet on a residential Internet Protocol address. Marcus reviewed the documents in silence for 10 long minutes. The only sound in the room was the crisp turn of the heavy paper and the faint hum of the city traffic far below the window. He was accustomed to messy familial disputes, usually involving tearful siblings fighting over vague promises and undocumented cash handshakes. He had never been handed a pristine, undeniable forensic audit, proving felony wire fraud and fiduciary negligence. He closed the binder and steepled his fingers, studying me with a new level of professional respect. "This is an immaculate chain of evidence," Marcus said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. "The documentation is flawless. If you want to hand this over to the district attorney, they will issue arrest warrants before the week is over. Alternatively, we can initiate a civil suit for severe breach of fiduciary duty and force your brother into a prolonged court battle to strip his executive title." I shook my head, my expression remaining perfectly neutral. A criminal referral would be messy, public, and out of my direct control. A civil lawsuit would drag on for years through discovery depositions and endless motions bleeding away my own capital in legal fees. I wanted a faster, cleaner resolution. I wanted a solution that relied on unassailable financial leverage rather than the unpredictable whims of a judge or a jury. I am not interested in a lengthy litigation process, I told him, looking directly into his eyes. And I have no intention of gifting my mother or my brother a single cent of my personal wealth to fix a problem they created. They drove to Austin today to demand a $500,000 liquidity transfer to stop the bank from seizing the commercial assets in the family home. They believe I am an easy target. I want to use my tech equity to prove them wrong. Marcus raised an eyebrow, recognizing the shift in my posture. I was no longer speaking as a concerned sister reporting a crime. I was speaking as an investor identifying a vulnerable target. "What is the objective?" he asked. "I want to execute a hostile debt acquisition." I replied, the words tasting crisp and precise. "Campbell Freight is in technical default. They have missed consecutive payments, and Trevor has violated multiple operational covenants of their commercial loan. The regional bank holding that note views it as a toxic, non-performing liability. They want it off their balance sheet before the quarter ends." Marcus nodded slowly, the strategic architecture of the maneuver clicking into place in his mind. In the corporate ecosystem of Texas legal asset protection and aggressive debt purchasing were standard tactics for forcing a change in ownership without ever stepping foot inside a courtroom. "You want me to approach the regional lender?" Marcus summarized, a genuine smile forming at the corner of his mouth. "You want to bypass your brother entirely and negotiate a quiet, expedited purchase of the senior secured debt on the secondary market." "Exactly," I said. "I will fund the acquisition through a blind trust limited liability company to mask my identity during the transaction. You will offer the bank a cash buyout for the distressed paper at a negotiated discount. Given the severity of the default and the impending regulatory headaches, the bank will be highly motivated to sell the note and walk away clean." The brilliance of the trap settled over the granite desk. My mother and brother were waiting in East Texas, expecting a naive tech employee to wire them a generous bailout to save their fraudulent enterprise. They thought they had backed me into a corner using emotional manipulation and the archaic guilt of familial duty. They had no idea I was leveraging my own financial independence to purchase the very chains that bound them. I was not going to be my brother's savior. I was not going to write a check to cover up my mother's complicity. By securing the primary commercial debt, I would hold the legal right to demand immediate repayment in full. I would gain the supreme authority to foreclose on the dispatch center, the commercial trucks, and the corporate operating accounts. "Draft the entity formation documents today," I instructed, standing up to gather my briefcase. "Contact the regional lender tomorrow morning. We move fast before Trevor realizes his mother failed to secure the extortion money." Marcus stood, offering a firm professional nod. The plan was cold, precise, and undeniably lethal. I walked out of the corner suite and stepped back into the fierce Texas heat, feeling the profound satisfaction of a hunter who has just locked the gate on the enclosure. I was going to become his bank, and when the time came to collect the currency I demanded, would be his total surrender. Marcus moved with the predatory efficiency I expected from a partner at a top-tier Austin law firm. By 10 o'clock the following morning, he had established a blind trust limited liability company registered in Delaware, a structure specifically designed to obscure the identity of the primary beneficiary. We named the entity Sentinel Node Acquisitions. The title sounded appropriately sterile, a faceless corporate shell that would raise zero suspicions when it approached a conservative regional lender in East Texas. While my mother and brother waited anxiously for a naive tech employee to wire them a blind bailout, I was funding an invisible financial vehicle designed to swallow their entire world. The transfer of my liquid capital into the Sentinel Node escrow account took less than an hour. I authorized the release of funds from my workstation on the 22nd floor, toggling between the legal wire portal and a client network diagnostics screen. There is a distinct rhythmic satisfaction in compartmentalizing a crisis. I spent the remainder of my Tuesday optimizing a cloud storage array for a healthcare startup, writing elegant strings of code, while Marcus initiated contact with the commercial lending division holding the Campbell Freight portfolio. The regional bank was headquartered in a modest brick building 200 miles away, operating on traditional banking metrics that despised unpredictability. Trevor had provided them with nothing but chaos. He had missed 3 consecutive quarterly payments, breached specific liquidity covenants, and ignored the warning notices sent by their compliance officers. The commercial note on the freight company had become a toxic liability on their balance sheet. Financial institutions are governed by risk mitigation, and a failing logistics business run by an unresponsive executive is the definition of high risk. When Marcus presented a formal, unsolicited cash offer to purchase the distressed senior debt, the bank executives did not hesitate or ask for a prolonged negotiation. They were eager to offload the bad paper before the upcoming fiscal reporting period. Marcus negotiated a steep discount, acquiring the entire debt portfolio for pennies on the dollar. The bank believed they were cutting their losses and transferring a severe headache to a distant corporate investment group. They did not know they were handing the leash of a runaway dog back to the only person capable of bringing it to heel. The legal process required a mandatory 72-hour waiting period to clear the regulatory checks and finalize the assignment of the loan documents. Those 3 days stretched before me like a quiet, empty corridor. I did not alter my routine. I attended my morning stand-up meetings, drank my dark roast coffee, and went for my evening runs along the trail bordering Lady Bird Lake. My phone remained silent. Diane and Trevor were clearly employing a waiting strategy, believing my silence meant I was struggling to navigate the banking bureaucracy to process their requested funds. They assumed I was stressed pacing my apartment, feeling the heavy burden of my father's legacy pressing down on my shoulders. They could not have been more wrong. I felt lighter than I had in years. Growing up, I often sat in the corner of my father's office while he reviewed his commercial loan documents. He treated debt with profound respect. He viewed a banknote as a solemn promise, a binding contract that tied his personal honor to the success of his trucks. Trevor viewed debt as a limitless credit card, a magical resource that required no actual accountability. He had taken the pristine credit history my father spent decades building and burned it to ash in less than 5 years. Sitting in my apartment, watching the sunset over the Texas Hill Country, I realized I was not just buying a financial instrument. I was purchasing the consequences my brother had spent his entire life avoiding. On Friday morning, my encrypted email client chimed with a priority notification from Marcus. The subject line contained a single word confirming the transaction. The escrow funds had been released. The bank had executed the assignment of the deed of trust, the security agreements, and the Uniform Commercial Code financing statements. The transfer was complete. I opened the secure attachment and scrolled through the digitized legal paperwork. The dense, formal language detailed the transfer of all rights, titles, and interests from the regional lender directly to Sentinel Node Acquisitions. I cross-referenced the entity ownership documents, verifying my position as the sole controlling member. The reality of the paperwork settled into my chest, bringing a cold, undeniable wave of authority. The shift in power was staggering. I now held the primary mortgage on the East Texas Dispatch Center and the surrounding commercial real estate. I held the unencumbered titles to every diesel truck, flatbed trailer, and forklift in the fleet. I held the senior liens on the corporate operating accounts, the payroll reserves, and the accounts receivable ledger. Trevor still held the executive title and the voting shares my father had bequeathed him in that mahogany paneled law office, but those shares were now effectively worthless. A chief executive officer controls the daily operations of a company, but a senior secured creditor controls the very oxygen the company breathes. I held the legal power to freeze the bank accounts, seize the physical assets, and initiate immediate foreclosure proceedings without filing a single lawsuit. I had achieved total dominance without my family knowing I had even left my desk. I transitioned from the discarded daughter, the technical afterthought sent away to Austin, to the apex predator of their financial ecosystem. The transformation required no shouting, no public tears, and no emotional performance in a corporate lobby. It only required data capital and the patience to let their own incompetence construct the trap. I closed the legal files and leaned back in my chair, staring out at the Austin skyline. The architecture of the trap was flawless, but a trap is useless unless the target steps onto the trigger plate. If I simply mailed them a foreclosure notice, Trevor would panic and attempt to hide the remaining liquid assets. Diane would spin a narrative of victimhood to her social circle, claiming a faceless corporation stole their livelihood. I needed them to understand exactly who was holding the pen. I needed to look them in the eyes when the illusion of their superiority shattered. To do that, I had to bring them into my territory. I had to lure them out of their comfortable East Texas stronghold and into the sterile, unforgiving environment of a modern tech boardroom. They still believed they were waiting for a naive sister to hand them a $500,000 rescue package. I decided to give them exactly what they wanted, or rather, the appearance of it. I reached for my phone, ready to initiate the final phase of the operation. I was going to invite the players to the table, and they were going to walk willingly into their own obsolescence. I picked up my smartphone from the sleek edge of my desk. The screen felt cool against my palm. I needed to calibrate my voice before initiating the call. Over the past several years, I had trained myself to speak with authority, removing the tentative cadence I used when I lived under my parents' roof. Now I had to find that old version of myself. I had to resurrect the submissive, over-responsible daughter who believed her only value lay in fixing her family problems. I took a deep breath, softening my posture and letting a feigned exhaustion seep into my vocal cords. I tapped my mother's contact name and listened to the line ring. She answered on the second ring. She did not say hello. "Have you structured the funds, Beatrice?" Her tone was sharp, carrying the residual irritation from her failed lobby ambush. I paused, letting a heavy, calculated sigh escape into the receiver. "Yes, Mom," I said, keeping my volume low and hesitant. I finished navigating the compliance protocols. The capital is ready to be deployed. I heard a swift intake of breath on her end, followed by the muffled sound of a hand covering the receiver. She was relaying the news to my brother. When she returned to the line, the irritation had vanished, replaced by a suffocating, triumphant sweetness. "I knew you would see reason, darling," Diane crooned. "Your father would be so proud of you for stepping up to protect the legacy. Trevor is right here. Let me put you on speaker." A static click echoed through the phone. Trevor cleared his throat. He spoke with the unearned confidence of a man who believed his sheer presence commanded respect. Growing up, he used that exact tone whenever he talked his way out of a speeding ticket or convinced a high school teacher to accept a late assignment. He always expected the world to bend to his convenience. "Good job, sis." Trevor said, a smirk clearly audible in his delivery. "I knew you just needed a few days to run your little computer checks. Just wire the cash to the primary operating account. I can handle the allocation from there." I closed my eyes and pictured the ghost payroll script siphoning money into his shell company. He thought he was about to receive a $500,000 deposit to fund his country club lifestyle. "I cannot execute a wire transfer remotely," I told him, injecting a note of authentic-sounding apology into my voice. My wealth management firm flagged the disbursement due to the size of the request and the current default status of the freight company. They require physical signatures on the final release documents. "That is ridiculous." Trevor scoffed, his patience instantly fraying. "We do business digitally all the time. Tell your bankers to send a secure link." I tried. I lied, maintaining my meek facade. "They are insisting on wet ink signatures to satisfy federal anti-money laundering regulations. You are the chief executive officer, Trevor. And Mom, you are listed as a secondary guarantor on the corporate profile. You both have to sign the paperwork in person, or the bank will not release the capital." I let the silence hang, waiting for their greed to override their inconvenience. If they wanted the money to save their fraudulent enterprise, they had to play by my rules. "Fine," Diane interjected, taking control of the conversation. "If your bank is going to be difficult, we will accommodate them. We can drive to Austin tomorrow morning. Have the paperwork ready, Beatrice. Trevor has a business to run, and we do not have time for bureaucratic delays." "I will reserve a boardroom in my office building," I replied softly. "See you tomorrow." I ended the call and set the phone down. The illusion was perfectly cast. They believed they had successfully bullied the tech geek into submission. They thought my request for physical signatures was just a tedious banking hurdle, a minor annoyance on their path to a massive payday. They were driving 3 hours to claim their victory, entirely unaware that the prize they sought no longer existed. The next morning, I arrived at the corporate tower an hour early to prepare the physical space. The environment needed to reflect the exact nature of the trap. I booked the primary executive boardroom on the top floor. It was a formidable space wrapped in floor-to-ceiling glass, showcasing an uninterrupted view of the Texas Hill Country. A long slab of white marble served as the conference table, surrounded by 12 ergonomic leather chairs. The room lacked any warmth or sentimentality. It was designed for high-stakes negotiations and definitive conclusions. I dressed with surgical precision. For years in East Texas, my mother criticized my wardrobe, telling me my practical clothes lacked the refinement necessary for a woman of status. She valued flashy brands and conspicuous displays of wealth. Today, I wore a tailored charcoal gray suit with clean, minimalist lines. The fabric was impeccable, the cut precise. I wore no jewelry other than a simple silver watch. My attire was modern corporate armor projecting competence and unassailable authority. At 10 o'clock, the receptionist notified me of their arrival. I took the glass elevator down to the main lobby. The space was bustling with software developers, venture capitalists, and data analysts moving with quiet purpose. Diane and Trevor stood near the reception desk, looking distinctly out of place. The visual contrast between us was striking. Trevor wore an overpriced navy pinstripe suit that looked too tight across his shoulders. He had paired it with a bright silk tie and a luxury diving watch. It was the uniform of a man trying desperately to look wealthy, purchased with stolen funds from a phantom logistics consulting firm. Diane stood beside him in a beige designer dress, gripping a branded leather handbag like a shield. They both projected a loud, arrogant energy that clashed with the sleek, understated hum of the tech ecosystem surrounding them. Trevor spotted me and offered a wide, condescending smile. He opened his arms as if preparing for an embrace, playing the role of the magnanimous older brother, forgiving his difficult sibling. "There is our favorite tech genius," Trevor announced, his voice carrying across the lobby. "Ready to finalize this little transaction." I did not step into his embrace. I offered a brief, professional nod. "Good morning, Trevor," I said. "Mom, thank you for making the drive. The documents are waiting upstairs." Diane scrutinized my charcoal suit, her eyes narrowing slightly as she processed the shift in my demeanor. I was no longer the hesitant daughter on the phone. I stood tall, my shoulders squared, holding a single manila folder containing the debt acquisition records. She sensed a discrepancy, a subtle deviation from the narrative she had constructed in her head, but her desire for the bailout blinded her instincts. "Let us just get this over with," Diane said, stepping past me toward the security gates. "I have a luncheon back home I prefer not to miss." I scanned my badge, granting them access to the secure elevators. We rode up to the executive floor in silence. Trevor checked his reflection in the mirrored doors, adjusting his silk tie with a smug expression. He truly believed he had won. He believed his sloppy ledger redactions and his ghost payroll script had survived my audit. He thought he was outsmarting everyone in the building. The elevator chimed, and the doors slid open. I led them down the polished concrete hallway toward the glass-walled boardroom. The space was flooded with natural light, exposing every corner. There were no shadows to hide behind in this room. I gestured for them to enter. Trevor walked in first, tossing his keys onto the white marble table with a loud clatter. He claimed the seat at the head of the table, leaning back and crossing his arms in a display of unearned dominance. Diane took the seat to his right, placing her designer handbag carefully on the chair beside her. They looked comfortable, victorious, and ready to collect their prize. I walked into the room last. I did not take a seat. I stood near the entrance, resting my hand on the heavy stainless steel handle of the glass door. I looked at the brother who stole from our legacy, and the mother who mortgaged her shelter to protect him. I pulled the door shut. The heavy latch clicked into place, sealing the room. The trapdoor was now firmly closed. The heavy stainless steel latch of the boardroom door clicked into place, sealing the three of us inside the soundproof glass walls. The acoustic isolation was immediate. The faint ambient hum of the tech developers working in the lobby vanished, replaced by the tense, expectant silence of a closed corporate negotiation. I stood near the entrance for a brief moment, observing the scene. Trevor unbuttoned his navy pinstripe suit jacket, leaning forward to project dominance over the white marble table. He surveyed the minimalist high-tech environment with a faint sneer, clearly believing that the software developers outside were soft and that he was the only real businessman in the building. He reached into his leather briefcase and extracted a thin stack of stapled papers. With a smooth, practiced motion, he slid the document across the polished surface toward my empty chair. He tapped the top page with his index finger, a patronizing gesture, instructing me where to direct my attention. My brother carried the distinct posture of a man accustomed to failing upward. Throughout his life, whenever a project collapsed or a semester ended in academic probation, a safety net magically appeared to catch him. He believed this document was just another net woven by the sister he viewed as a subservient bank account. Diane sat to his right, wearing a sickeningly sweet smile. It was the same curated expression she used at charity auctions when bidding on centerpieces she did not truly want. The maternal warmth was a fabricated shield designed to smooth over the sheer audacity of the request. She folded her hands in her lap, waiting for me to assume my assigned role, sit down, and pick up the pen. I walked to my chair, but did not sit down. I glanced at the title printed at the top of the stapled pages. It was drafted as an unconditional capital gift agreement. He was not offering a structured promissory note. He was not yielding a single fraction of equity voting rights or board representation. The contract explicitly stated that the $500,000 would be received as a non-refundable familial contribution to the operating reserves. He actually expected me to sign away $500,000 without a single legal protection or claim to the business. He acted as though allowing me to fund his failure was a generous privilege, a favor he was granting me to stay connected to the family name. I did not pick up this pen. I placed my fingertips on the edge of the thick paper and slid it back across the cold marble. The contract stopped right in front of Trevor's folded arms. His smug expression faltered for a fraction of a second. Diane shifted in her leather chair, her sweet smile turning rigid as confusion clouded her features. I walked to the head of the table, opened my briefcase, and withdrew my laptop. I set the device down and connected the high-definition multimedia cable to the port embedded in the marble. The wall-sized display monitor behind me flickered to life, bathing the room in a sharp, crisp glow. Trevor let out a heavy, dramatic sigh, leaning back and tossing his pen onto the table. He rolled his eyes, assuming I was preparing to present a tedious list of budgetary suggestions or operational critiques. He was gearing up to dismiss my technical analysis the same way he dismissed my custom routing code 5 years ago. "I am not signing that contract, Trevor," I said quietly, keeping my gaze locked on his eyes, "because I do not invest in companies with ghost payrolls." I pressed the Enter key on my keyboard. The wall-sized screen illuminated. It did not show colorful pie charts or generic financial summaries. It displayed the raw server access logs from Campbell Freight's back-end enterprise resource planning software. The text cascaded in stark black and white, highlighting the anomalous digital footprints I had extracted the night before. I had enlarged the specific data points to make them impossible to ignore. Right in the center of the screen sat the chronological record of the Internet Protocol logins occurring precisely at 2 o'clock every Sunday morning. Next to the timestamps, I displayed the automated clearinghouse routing commands. The data clearly showed the capital draining from the primary corporate operating account, bypassing the standard payroll tax deductions, and flowing directly into the external ledger belonging to Summit Advisory Group. Below the server logs, I had formatted a clean chronological table matching those exact disbursement amounts to his recent personal acquisitions. The dates of the phantom payouts aligned perfectly with the down payment on his luxury watercraft and the initiation fees for his private golf club in Southlake. Trevor stared at the glowing wall. The healthy, confident flush drained from his face in an instant, leaving a pale, chalky pallor. He opened his mouth, closed it, and swallowed hard. The silence in the room stretched out heavy and suffocating. He looked at the screen, then at me, realizing the depth of the surveillance I had conducted. The firewall he thought protected his secret life had been reduced to transparent glass. "This is internal administrative data." Trevor stammered, his voice losing its confident baritone resonance. He sat forward, planting his hands on the table, attempting to summon a blustering defense to cover his rising panic. "You do not understand the operational expenses of a complex logistics firm. That vendor is a legitimate contractor. It is consulting overhead for strategic routing analysis. You cannot just hack into my system and misinterpret standard corporate expenditures." He was grasping at smoke, hoping to confuse the issue with vague corporate terminology. He believed he could still talk his way out of the corner, relying on the old dynamic where his loud confidence overruled my quiet logic. He tried to project righteous indignation, acting as though my investigation was the true violation of trust. I did not argue with him. I did not raise my voice to point out the absurdity of a consultant working at 2 a.m. on a Sunday, or the fact that Summit Advisory Group was a shell entity registered to a post office box in a luxury zip code. I did not remind him that he was the one who voluntarily gave me the administrator password, granting me full legal access to the server. I simply tapped the spacebar on my keyboard. The presentation clicked to the next slide. The screen transitioned from the ghost payroll logs to a side-by-side forensic comparison of the Horizon Logistics Solutions procurement contract. On the left side, the exorbitant fee structures and automatic renewal clauses were highlighted in stark red text. The numbers demonstrated a 300% markup over standard industry rates for obsolete glitching software that actively harmed the delivery metrics of the freight yard. On the right side of the screen, I displayed the State Commerce Registry filings identifying Blake Harding as the sole proprietor of the Vendor Limited Liability Company. Below Blake's name, I placed the digital metadata from the contract authorization file. The timestamp and the internal Internet Protocol address proved that Trevor had personally executed the agreement from his executive terminal in East Texas. I watched Trevor process the image on the display. 10 years ago, he and Blake spent their university days figuring out how to cheat the grading system, assuming they would always be smarter than the people doing the actual work. Now the empirical proof of their collusion was projected on a 10-foot high-definition display in the heart of Silicon Hills. The data stripped away every defense he had prepared. It was not a misinterpretation. It was a documented, time-stamped betrayal of his fiduciary duty to the legacy he claimed to revere. The temperature in the boardroom seemed to plummet. The residual warmth of Diane's fabricated sweetness vanished entirely, leaving a cold, tense vacuum in its wake. Trevor shrank into his expensive, poorly fitted suit. His bravado crumbled, replaced by the cornered, erratic energy of a man who suddenly realizes the person he intended to con is the one holding the executioner's axe. The reality of the digital footprint crushed his ability to spin a new lie. He darted a desperate look toward our mother, seeking a lifeline, searching for the matriarch to intervene and restore the natural order where he always emerged unscathed. Trevor stared at the glowing projection on the wall, his bravado dissolving into a panicked, erratic silence. He darted a desperate look toward the right side of the white marble table, seeking the one resource he had relied on his entire life. He was looking at Diane. My mother recognized the silent plea immediately. She had spent 30 years answering it. Whenever my brother failed a vital exam, dented a company vehicle, or missed a crucial shipping deadline, Diane was always there to smooth the edges, draft an excuse, and protect the pristine family image. She placed her hands flat on the table, took a slow, deliberate breath, and summoned the polished, impenetrable matriarch persona she used to govern her local social circles. "Beatrice, darling, enough of this nonsense," she said. Her voice was smooth-coated in a layer of artificial warmth designed to de-escalate the tension and disarm the threat. We did not drive all the way to Austin to look at computer screens or argue over confusing technical jargon. Trevor is under a tremendous amount of stress right now. Running a logistics empire is highly complicated. Sometimes operational funds have to be moved around to keep the trucks on the road and the drivers paid. You are blowing a standard accounting practice out of proportion. She reached across the marble and tapped the predatory gift contract Trevor had slid toward me earlier. "We appreciate your diligence, sweetheart, but it is time to put the spreadsheets away. Sign the disbursement authorization. Let us finish this transaction so we can all go home and enjoy the rest of the holiday weekend. Family takes care of family, remember." I looked at the woman sitting across from me. For a very long time, her approval was the only currency I ever wanted to earn. When I was a teenager, I used to spend hours optimizing the dispatch routing code in the sweltering freight yard, hoping she would look at my work and recognize my inherent value. She never did. She only valued the things that maintained her reflection in the eyes of East Texas society. She viewed my intellect as an inconvenience, a disruption to the traditional hierarchy she worked so hard to maintain. I did not reach for the pen. I did not break eye contact with her. I rested my fingers lightly on my laptop keyboard. "You are right about one thing, Mom," I said, my voice steady, carrying the sterile, unforgiving chill of a climate-controlled server room. "This is not about technical jargon. This is about survival." I tapped the spacebar. The high-definition display behind me shifted instantly. The ghost payroll logs and the procurement fraud records vanished from the screen. The monitor filled with a stark, high-contrast image of a legal document. It was not a corporate ledger or a routing manifest. It was a property deed. Specifically, it was the deed to the sprawling brick house set back on 3 acres of manicured lawn where I grew up. Below the deed, I displayed the public county filing for the high-interest commercial bridge loan. Diane stopped smiling. Her hands retracted from the marble, pulling back to her lap, as if the table had suddenly turned scalding hot. Her perfect posture stiffened. Trevor leveraged the primary residence to secure a sudden infusion of cash. I stated, addressing the room, but keeping my eyes locked on my mother. "He used the roof over your head as collateral to cover the gaping hole his embezzlement created in the corporate operating accounts." Trevor opened his mouth to interject, ready to offer another blustering excuse about liquidity requirements. I raised a single hand, stopping him instantly. The gesture was simple, but it carried the undeniable weight of the data glowing behind me. He closed his mouth and shrank back into his chair. When I first discovered the secondary lien, I actually felt sorry for you. I continued, speaking directly to Diane. I thought my brother had deceived you. I thought he had brought you a stack of routine business forms and told you to sign on the dotted line without explaining the financial risk. I thought you were an uninformed victim of his greed. I pressed the right arrow key on my keyboard. The slide zoomed in on the bottom of the final page of the bridge loan agreement. The digital signature block filled the screen, displaying my mother's elegant looping cursive. Next to her signature, I placed the extracted metadata from the electronic certificate. But digital signatures record far more than just an image of a name. I explained, letting the raw facts lay bare the reality of her choices. They record the exact time, date, hardware identification, and internet protocol address of the device used to execute the binding agreement. I pointed to the precise strings of text projected on the screen. This certificate proves the loan was authorized at 3 p.m. on a Tuesday. It was authorized from the residential internet connection at your house, and it was authorized using an Apple iPad Pro. The remaining color drained from Diane's face, matching the pale shade of the conference table. Trevor did not use Apple products. He despised them, preferring his customized machines. I had purchased that specific tablet for Diane 3 years ago as a Mother's Day gift. She used it every single day to manage her calendar and read digital magazines. You did not sign this in the dark, I said, my voice dropping to a lethal quiet register. You logged onto your own personal device. You read the loan terms. You knew the company was failing, and you knew the money was missing, because you are the original bookkeeper for Campbell Freight. You recognized the embezzlement. Instead of stopping him, you mortgaged your own shelter to finance the cover-up, hoping the cash injection would keep the regional bank from looking too closely at the ledgers. Diane sat frozen in her ergonomic leather chair. The polished facade she had maintained for 30 years began to fracture visibly. The truth was projected in 10-foot-tall letters, stripping away her ability to play the helpless, uninformed widow. When the bridge loan money ran out, the default loomed again. I continued delivering the final devastating conclusion. The bank prepared to seize the deed to your house. You did not come here today to save Dad's legacy. You came here to steal my money to cover your son's felony before the bank found out. The boardroom descended into a profound, suffocating silence. For several agonizing seconds, the only sound was the quiet whir of the laptop cooling fan. I watched my mother process the reality of her exposure. The narrative she had constructed, the story where she was the noble matriarch saving the family from ruin, disintegrated into fine ash. Then the fragile glass of her composure shattered entirely. Diane stood up. Her chair scraped backward against the polished concrete floor, producing a harsh grating sound that echoed off the transparent walls. Her hands balled into tight fists at her sides. The pristine country club posture dissolved, replaced by a raw, unhinged fury. "How dare you speak to me that way?" she screamed, her voice shrill and devoid of its usual manufactured sweetness. "You sit in your shiny glass tower, and you judge us. You abandoned this family the second your father died. You ran off to this sterile city because you have no idea what it takes to survive in the real world." She pointed a trembling finger at me, resorting to the old familiar insults she used whenever I questioned the family dynamic during my childhood. "You are just jealous," she yelled, her volume rising with every frantic word. "You have always been jealous of your brother. You never understood the realities of business. You never understood loyalty. You think looking at a few computer screens makes you superior to the people who actually built a life. You are a cold, bitter girl who cares more about spreadsheets than her own flesh and blood." I did not stand up. I did not raise my voice to defend my choices or list my accomplishments. I remained perfectly seated, my hands resting lightly on the keyboard. I embodied the true strength of a person who no longer requires external validation from the people who failed her. She paced the short length of the marble table, her designer heels clicking frantically. She yelled about sacrifice. She yelled about respect. She hurled wild accusations, trying to provoke a reaction, trying to drag me into a chaotic emotional shouting match where she could regain her footing. She wanted me to fight back. She needed me to act like the difficult, unruly daughter so she could feel justified in her betrayal. I gave her nothing. I sat in perfect stillness and observed her. When you manage network security, you learn that engaging directly with a localized threat only feeds the disruption. The most effective containment strategy is to let the hostile program exhaust its own resources against an impenetrable firewall. I let her yell. I let the ugly, desperate insults bounce off the soundproof glass walls of the boardroom. Outside in the corporate lobby, a few software engineers paused their work, glancing through the transparent walls at the woman losing her mind in the middle of a high-tech sanctuary. They could not hear her words, but they could see the frantic, unhinged reality of her panic. Eventually, her voice cracked. Her breath grew ragged. The adrenaline spike faded, leaving her hollow and exhausted. She stopped pacing and leaned against the edge of the table, clutching her leather handbag to her chest like a shield. She looked at me, expecting to see anger or hurt in my eyes. She saw only clinical detachment. The silence returned to the room, heavier and more definitive than before. She had deployed every weapon in her emotional arsenal, and none of them had even scratched the surface of my resolve. By remaining calm while she unraveled, the dynamic shifted permanently. The data proved the financial crime, but her hysterical reaction proved the moral guilt. The loudest person in the room is always the weakest, and the quiet echoed with her ultimate defeat. The silence in the boardroom stretched thin and fragile, settling over the white marble table like a layer of frost. Diane stood frozen near the edge of her chair, the frantic energy drained from her sudden outburst. Her chest heaved with uneven breaths, but she had finally stopped yelling. She realized her emotional performance held zero currency in this environment. Trevor, however, still possessed the unearned confidence of a man who had never faced a real consequence. He adjusted his bright silk tie, though the knot was already slipping from its perfect center. Sweat beaded along his hairline, catching the harsh fluorescent light above us. He looked at the high-definition display, projecting his financial crimes, then back at me, attempting to construct a final desperate bluff. He planted his hands on his hips, jutting his chin forward. He told me my presentation was out of line. He insisted he was still the chief executive officer of Campbell Freight. He claimed he still held the voting shares our father bequeathed him, making him the sole legal authority over the enterprise. If I refused to provide the requested capital, he sneered, he would simply secure funding from a private equity group in Dallas. He reached for his leather briefcase, snapping the brass lock shut with a sharp metallic clatter. He threatened to walk right out the glass door, promising to leave me out of the lucrative logistics market entirely. I watched him gather his belongings. I did not move to block his exit. I did not raise my voice to argue against his delusion. Instead, I reached into my own sleek briefcase and retrieved a thick legal manila folder. The paper felt heavy in my hands, carrying the weight of a meticulously executed financial maneuver. I placed it on the white marble table and slid it across the smooth surface. It stopped inches from his fingers. He paused, his hand hovering over the handle of his bag. I told him he was free to leave the room, but he needed to understand the landscape he was walking into before he crossed the threshold. You own the shares of a company that is currently in default. I explained, my voice steady and lethal. But I own the debt. Trevor froze. He looked at the closed manila folder, a flicker of genuine apprehension breaking through his arrogant facade. He slowly pulled the tab open and flipped to the first page. The document displayed the official assignment of the deed of trust, transferring the senior secured commercial loan from his regional bank directly to Sentinel Node Acquisitions, my blind trust entity. I watched his eyes scan the dense legal text, watching his pupils dilate as he recognized the severity of the transaction. I explained the mechanics of the acquisition with sterile precision. I was not a minority investor offering a familial bailout. I was his primary secured creditor, and I was calling the commercial loan due immediately. I laid out his options. He could sign the transfer of equity documents enclosed at the back of the folder, yielding 100% of his voting shares to me and walk away from the business empty-handed. Or he could refuse. If he refused to sign, I would initiate immediate foreclosure proceedings. I would seize the dispatch center, liquidate the commercial fleet, and freeze the corporate operating accounts by the end of the business day. Furthermore, I would hand the pristine 40-page forensic embezzlement report directly to the Texas Attorney General, ensuring his next meeting would be with a state prosecutor rather than a private equity firm. Trevor was trapped in a legally unassailable corner. The $500,000 he came to collect was never a bailout. It was the precise cost of buying my father's company out from under the son who ruined it. The reality of his position settled over him like a physical weight. The lifelong assumption that he was the rightful heir to an empire evaporated into the filtered air of the boardroom. He was not a sharp businessman negotiating a tough merger. He was a thief caught in a localized audit, outsmarted by the sister he had spent his entire life underestimating. His shoulders slumped, the expensive fabric of his suit bunching awkwardly around his neck. He stared at the transfer of equity contract. He reached into his jacket pocket and retrieved his own silver pen. His hand carried a visible rhythmic tremor. The golden son, the boy who had been handed every advantage and every excuse, lowered the pen to the paper. The scratching sound of the ink against the thick page echoed in the quiet room. He signed his name, relinquishing the legacy he had squandered. He pushed the folder back across the marble, his gaze fixed firmly on the floor. Diane watched the exchange with growing horror. The transfer of the company secured my position and shielded Trevor from a criminal referral, but it offered zero protection for her personal liability. The high-interest bridge loan tied to the family home remained active, and the cash she expected me to provide to pay it off was never going to arrive. The curated matriarchal facade shattered into dust. Her knees buckled. Diane dropped to the polished concrete floor, the fabric of her designer dress pooling awkwardly around her legs. She did not yell this time. She begged. Genuine tears spilled down her cheeks, ruining her careful makeup. She clasped her hands together, looking up at me from the ground. She asked where she was supposed to live when the predatory lender foreclosed on her house. She pleaded for mercy, asking me to remember the life we shared in East Texas, begging me to just pay off the lien so she could keep her shelter. I looked down at the woman kneeling on the floor. I felt a profound, chilling clarity. I did not feel the urge to comfort her, nor did I feel the urge to mock her. I simply recognized the outcome of a mathematical equation she had written herself. I picked up the manila folder containing the signed transfer documents. I tapped the edges against the table, squaring the pages into a neat, organized stack. "Dad said daughters do not run businesses," I stated, placing the folder securely into my briefcase and snapping the lock shut. He was right. We do not run them into the ground. We acquire them. I looked at my brother, who refused to meet my eyes, and then down at my mother, who was still weeping on the concrete. I informed them they had 30 days to vacate the premises of Campbell Freight. My tech logistics team would arrive in East Texas on the 1st of the month to begin the rebranding and restructuring process. Any personal items left in the executive offices after the deadline would be discarded. I turned my attention back to Diane. I told her I would not authorize a single cent to pay off her bridge loan. The consequences of their fraud would land squarely on their own shoulders. She had willingly mortgaged her security to enable a thief, and she would have to face the lender on her own. I reached across the white marble table and pressed the silver intercom button connected to the lobby reception desk. I asked David to send security to the executive floor. Within moments, 2 uniformed guards appeared at the transparent glass door. I opened it for them, stepping aside to clear the path. I instructed the guards to escort my guests out of the building. Trevor stood up, his face pale and drawn. He reached down and grasped Diane by the arm, hauling her to her feet. She stumbled slightly, her designer handbag slipping from her grasp before Trevor caught it. They did not attempt to argue with the guards. The fight had been entirely drained from them. They walked out of the boardroom in silence. There was no screaming, no dramatic final confrontation, and no lingering threats. The ultimate severance was clean, professional, and definitive. I stood alone in the quiet room, looking out over the Austin skyline, holding the title to the empire they had lost. 6 months later, the Texas heat returned, baking the limestone and glass of the Austin skyline. The dust from the acquisition had long since settled, leaving behind a clean, unobstructed view of the future. I sat behind a sleek, minimalist desk in the newly established headquarters of Campbell Logistics and Tech Solutions. The heavy mahogany panels and the stale scent of cigar smoke from my father's era were gone forever. In their place stood transparent walls, acoustic tiles that absorbed sound, and a corporate culture built strictly on verifiable data. The first 30 days following the boardroom transition were clinical and precise. My technical team drove to East Texas and conducted a total systemic overhaul of the old dispatch center. We uninstalled the obsolete routing software Trevor had purchased from his college friend. We ripped out the inefficient code and replaced it with the proprietary algorithm I had originally written a decade ago, now updated and optimized for a modern cloud server architecture. The impact on the profit margins was immediate and undeniable. Delivery windows tightened by 30%. Idle time vanished. Fuel costs plummeted. The commercial fleet, once rusting and dormant under my brother's mismanagement, was now running at peak capacity. My father had spent 40 years trying to force a profit margin out of sheer labor. By applying actual strategic competence and forward-thinking technological innovation, I made the company more profitable in 6 months than he had in a lifetime. I also cleaned out the executive suite. The archaic boys' club Trevor had installed was dismantled piece by piece. There were no more unqualified friends occupying high-salaried positions, draining resources while providing zero value. I replaced the sycophants with professionals chosen strictly on merit. I hired brilliant supply chain experts, rigorous network security analysts, and seasoned logistics veterans who respected the trade. We did not care where they went to college or who their parents were. We only cared if they could execute the work. I raised the wages for the actual truck drivers, the people who generated the real revenue, ensuring that the working foundation of the company was strong and loyal. As for my family, the consequences of their own arithmetic arrived precisely on schedule. Trevor did not find a private equity savior to rescue him. Instead, the paper trail I had meticulously documented found its way into a routine federal review. When you establish a shell entity in a luxury zip code and funnel untaxed corporate capital into it to purchase watercraft, you invite severe scrutiny. The Internal Revenue Service initiated a comprehensive audit of his personal and business finances. Without the freight company's operating reserves to pay for expensive legal counsel, Trevor was left to face the federal investigators on his own. He was drowning in inquiries, penalties, and back taxes, learning the hard way that a charming smile holds zero currency with a forensic auditor. His days of failing upward had officially come to an end. Diane faced a different kind of accounting. The regional bank executed the foreclosure on the primary residence just as I had predicted. The high-interest bridge loan she had authorized from her personal tablet collapsed under its own weight. The bank seized the sprawling brick house with the manicured lawns. I heard through a former neighbor that Diane had to hire a discount moving company to transport her belongings. She relocated to a modest 2-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city, a space far too small to host her charity committee meetings. She lost her country club membership. She lost her weekly luncheons. Most importantly, she lost the social status that she had valued above the well-being of her own daughter. The community she had spent 30 years cultivating quietly turned its back on her, distancing themselves from the scandal of a foreclosed home and a son under federal investigation. She had tried to sacrifice my future to protect her reflection, and the mirror had shattered anyway. I did not feel a sense of tragedy when I received these updates. I felt the quiet, profound satisfaction of a closed loop. They had designed their own downfall, and I had simply refused to stand in the way of gravity. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair and looked at the wall opposite my desk. I did not hang a portrait of my father, and I did not display any sentimental family photographs. Instead, I had framed a single document in a stark black frame. It was the original debt acquisition contract, the assignment of the deed of trust that transferred the senior commercial loan to Sentinel Node Acquisitions. Every time I looked at that contract, I remembered the sweltering July afternoon in the estate attorney's office. I remembered my father leaving the entire voting share of his company to my brother, explicitly stating that daughters do not run businesses. I remembered my mother offering a pitying smile, expecting me to accept my designated place as a subservient discarded asset. They believed tradition and gender would dictate the hierarchy of our lives forever. They were wrong. The tech entrepreneurial ecosystem I embraced taught me that true power is not inherited. It is engineered. I did not just survive my family's betrayal. I monetized their arrogance. I leveraged their incompetence to buy my father's legacy for pennies on the dollar, and then I rebuilt it into a fortress they could never breach. The best response to being underestimated is not a loud argument or a tearful plea. It is undisputed, undeniable success achieved entirely on your own terms. My name is Beatrice Campbell, and I am the Chief Executive Officer of Campbell Logistics and Tech Solutions. If you are sitting in a room right now where people measure your worth by archaic rules, let them underestimate you. Let them believe you are quiet, submissive, and easily managed. Do not raise your voice. Do not demand a seat at their table. Walk away, learn the systems they rely on, and then buy the building they are sitting in. If you have ever stopped trying to save people who are determined to ruin you, tell me your story in the comments below. I read every single one. Thank you for joining me for this chapter of Still Drama Stories. Be sure to subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Protect your peace, and always verify the data.
There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a family when their long-held illusions finally shatter. It is not the quiet of peace, but the heavy, ringing stillness that follows a long-overdue reckoning. Beatrice Campbell's story is far more than a masterful execution of corporate justice. It is a profound mirror held up to the modern American family. It forces us to ask a terrifying question when we say we are protecting our children. Are we actually just protecting our own reflections? In the pursuit of the American dream, where success is so frequently measured by accumulation status and the preservation of a flawless public image, the true essence of parenting can easily become corrupted. The Campbell family tragedy serves as a masterclass in this slow decay. Their downfall was not caused by a fluctuating economy, a bad freight market, or simple bad luck. It was orchestrated from the inside out by a profound absence of three foundational pillars: wisdom, morality, and resilience. True wisdom in raising a child does not lie in the trust funds you establish or the corporate empires you leave behind. It lies in the courage to see your children exactly as they are. Beatrice's father built his legacy on sweat and grit, yet his vision was ultimately blinded by an archaic limiting bias. He looked at a brilliant, capable daughter and saw only tradition. He looked at an entitled, reckless son and saw a rightful heir. This is the danger of parental ignorance. When parents impose their own rigid expectations or outdated social scripts onto their children, they do not just stifle potential, they actively engineer failure. True parental wisdom requires looking at your children through a lens of absolute clarity and fairness. It means evaluating their character, their competence, and their moral fiber, rather than allowing your ego to dictate who they are supposed to be. This same lack of wisdom crippled Diane. She lived entirely within the hollow shell of social prestige, prioritizing her country club reputation over the integrity of her own household. When parents choose to live in a delusion merely to protect their social standing, they teach their children that appearances are more valuable than truth. Facing reality, no matter how ugly or painful, even if it means admitting your golden child is deeply flawed, is the ultimate act of parental wisdom. We often confuse love with enabling. In traditional family structures, the word family is frequently weaponized to demand unconditional loyalty, even when that loyalty requires moral compromise. Diane's love for Trevor was in reality a slow-acting poison. By constantly sweeping his failures under the rug, paying off his debts, and eventually mortgaging her own shelter to hide his crimes, Diane robbed her son of the most crucial mechanism for human growth consequences. In a spiritual sense, she deprived him of his own karma. Ethical parenting is not about shielding your children from the pain of their mistakes. It is about standing beside them as they face the music. True love is compassionate discipline. When parents continuously act as a safety net for malicious or reckless behavior, they raise fragile adults who believe the rules of morality simply do not apply to them. Beatrice's refusal to write a bailout check was an act of profound moral courage. She recognized that the concept of family should never be a shield for toxic behavior. Family should represent mutual respect and a shared commitment to doing what is right. By forcing her mother and brother to face the unmitigated disaster of their own choices, Beatrice offered them the only kind of love that had any real value left, the brutal, cleansing light of accountability. Resilience is never forged in the comfort of a parent's blind indulgence. It is hammered into existence through adversity, independence, and the painful necessity of standing on one's own 2 feet. The contrast between the Campbell siblings serves as a stark warning. Trevor was handed every advantage, yet he crumbled at the first sign of real pressure. He was weak because his muscles of self-reliance had never been exercised. Beatrice, on the other hand, was discarded. Yet from that rejection, she built a fortress. The greatest inheritance a parent can leave a child in modern America is not a stock portfolio or a corner office. It is the raw capacity for survival. It is the grit to face a storm and the emotional awareness to navigate it without losing your center. Perhaps the most striking lesson from Beatrice is her mastery of inner stillness. In a culture that often equates volume with power, Beatrice won her war without ever raising her voice. She did not succumb to the toxic emotional chaos her mother desperately tried to incite. She maintained her boundaries. This is the ultimate form of resilience, the ability to govern your own mind. Parents must cultivate this emotional awareness within themselves first, so they can model it for their children. When a family operates from a place of calm rationality, rather than reactive ego, they build a foundation that no external crisis can break. Ultimately, the story of the Campbells is a cautionary tale about the necessity of self-correction. You cannot raise honest, resilient, and morally grounded children if you are unwilling to confront your own flaws. Diane and her late husband placed their pride, their vanity, and their societal standing above justice and truth. Their family did not fracture because of a lack of money. It fractured because it was built on a foundation devoid of self-awareness. To create a truly healthy family ecosystem, parents must be willing to do the grueling internal work. They must strip away the vanity, discard the obsession with outward appearances, and commit to living authentically. Only then can they raise children equipped with true wisdom, unshakable morality, and enduring resilience. Beatrice's final maneuver was not an act of vengeance. It was a severe, disciplined form of compassion. She did not save them with her wealth because doing so would have only prolonged their sickness. Instead, she saved them by dismantling their illusions, leaving them with nothing but the raw, unfiltered truth of who they had become. If this reflection on the quiet battles we fight behind closed doors resonated with you, there are many more narratives waiting to be uncovered. Drop a comment below with your own experiences of drawing hard boundaries, and subscribe to Still Drama Stories for more quiet tales of ordinary people finding their strength. As the dust settles on the Campbell estate, a lingering thought remains. We spend our lives building walls to protect the things we love, convinced that the danger always lies on the outside. But what happens when we finally look in the mirror and realize the quietest, most devastating threats were the ones we lovingly nurtured in our own living rooms? The legacy we leave behind is rarely the one we intended. It is simply the echo of the truths we were brave enough to face, or the lies we were too afraid to dismantle.